As you begin to close your eyes and allow your body to sink into the calm of the night that slowly wraps around the space near you, I invite you to breathe gently and let your thoughts settle like dust drifting softly through the air. Imagine yourself in a room that feels warm and tender with dim light that does not force your eyes to stay awake. A quiet breeze brushes gently, as if removing the weight you may have carried throughout the day. In this soothing atmosphere, you are invited to follow a story from a time long before the world was properly mapped. Before the shape of seas and continents was clearly known, and before humans fully understood the land on which they lived. I invite you to stay relaxed, to keep your breathing soft, and to let your mind drift like mountain water flowing without haste. A story will unfold before you about an old map, once trusted by sailors, merchants, and thinkers of the medieval world. A map that seemed to portray a world far larger than anything they knew, yet at the same time concealed strange inconsistencies that slowly raised questions in the minds of all who observed it. Before you move deeper, you do not need to think about anything. Simply feel this journey as a gentle current, carrying you to the distant past without straining your mind or trying to hold on to any detail. Allow the story to approach you in its own rhythm while you remain calm and comfortable. If at any moment your eyes wish to close completely, let them do so. And if you prefer to keep listening with quiet curiosity, the story will continue to flow like a long river on a silent night. You only need to be present in this calm state and let the tale unfold, carrying you to a time when the world was not yet fully known. And a map could become a source of hope or fear, depending on who looked at it. In the next 2 hours, you will be guided through the traces of mapmakers who lived in the shadows of churches, marketplaces, and uncertain sea voyages. Enjoy each step with relaxation and allow yourself to drift into a world that no longer exists, yet still leaves faint marks among legends, history, and human imagination. In the year 1365, when Europe was still filled with thick fog that covered trade routes, and deep forests stretching far toward unstable borders of kingdoms, brave travelers who left the land often returned with stories that seemed more like dreams than actual reports. You may imagine that time when nights felt longer than days and candlelight was the only guide for those who wished to read or write travel notes that later became references for mapmakers. In those years, a map was not merely a navigation tool, but also a window into a world largely unseen by human eyes. In several cities, such as Genoa and Venice, mapmakers worked diligently while listening to sailors arriving from the east or the south, bringing tales of unrecorded continents and seas said to stretch endlessly. Yet their notes were often bound by fear and religious beliefs, making the lines they drew on parchment represent not only distance and landform, but also beliefs about strange creatures, forbidden regions, or waters considered to be the edge of the world. You might imagine the atmosphere of their workshop filled with the scent of aged wood and dense ink as a mapmaker sat at a long table trying to capture anything that might serve as a geographical clue, even though its truth could rarely be confirmed. Outside the window, the marketplace remained lively, with merchants selling spices and fabrics. Yet for those in the workshop, the world they depicted was not a world that could be touched, but one shaped by imagination mixed with a little fact and a great deal of uncertainty. In that era, a map could guide a ship, alter the life of a merchant, strengthen or frighten a king, and shape collective beliefs about the world beyond the horizon. When you imagine this period, you begin to understand how significant a map was in shaping human ideas about their bumpé chase, about their place on Earth before the world was known, before seas were charted, and before reality erased myths that had endured for centuries. In those times, the locations where the strangest maps often appeared were not centers of power, but secluded monasteries standing far from bustling cities and noisy harbors. You may imagine large stone buildings with thick walls holding the cold of night, and inner courtyards filled with long shadows cast by trees growing without order. In their quietest rooms, manuscript scribes and archivists sat for hours with bowed heads copying travel notes that even they were unsure whether true or merely exaggerated legends. They worked with a devotion rarely seen in modern times, because for them to copy the world was to rearrange the creation of God. Within that silence, they received scrolls brought by pilgrims from distant lands who claimed to have seen seas unrecorded by anyone or lands that appeared suddenly beyond the horizon. The scribes had no way of verifying these tales, yet they documented them as though each word was truth that had to be preserved. You may imagine how every line drawn on parchment represented something that might exist only in the human mind, yet still carried the power to shape history. It was during this era that maps depicting islands that never existed or vast continents, filled with symbols and short notes about strange beings believed to inhabit the region, began to appear. When you peer into their imagination, you understand that the world for them was a mixture of what was seen and what was believed. There was no clear boundary between reality and story, so every travel account became a new possibility worth illustrating. In many monasteries, map-making became part of their intellectual ritual, a way to understand the world through silence and disciplined craftsmanship. Yet because of their isolation, the maps they produced differed greatly from those of sailors. While sailors' maps tried to depict practical routes, the monastery maps were filled with symbolic ornaments representing fear, hope, and spiritual conviction. You may picture a scribe drawing a strange creature in the corner of a parchment, not because he truly believed it existed, but to warn that beyond the known area lay places humans should not enter. From this emerged maps that created a dilemma, whether they served as guides or as reminders that the world still held secrets not yet ready to be revealed to humankind. In the early medieval period, when travel accounts were more often spoken than neatly written on parchment, you may imagine how information changed shape each time it passed from one sailor to another. In the small harbors scattered along the northern coasts of Europe, merchants gathered around fire pits, sharing tales of seas far beyond the reach of human sight. They spoke of winds that spun without direction, currents that seemed to pull ships toward places no one had ever seen, and strange lights appearing along the horizon on certain nights. Occasionally, an old sailor whose face carried the marks of age would add a tale about an island that appeared only when the fog thickened, or a vast land said to lie beyond the western wind, yet everyone who sought it always returned with nothing to show. Such information often traveled into monasteries, carried by wanderers, and eventually landed on the tables of manuscript scribes who attempted to turn those shifting stories into something permanent. You can almost sense how a world not yet mapped began to form, not through direct observation, but through scattered tales shared by those who lived close to the sea and its uncertainty. Amid this unstable flow of stories, one recurring pattern began to draw the attention of archivists who felt compelled to record it more carefully. There were repeated accounts of an immense sea described as too calm and too symmetrical by seasoned sailors. They claimed the water reflected the sky like a flawless mirror, while the surrounding wind moved with an unnaturally steady rhythm. At the center of that sea, according to several accounts, lay a long, straight path, a line that could not have formed naturally. It looked like a boundary dividing one realm from another, as if the world were split into two territories unaware of each other. Some sailors claimed to see faint shapes of land in the distance, but as they approached, the land dissolved like a shadow, shifting with the light. You may sense how such tales created tension among mapmakers who were accustomed to uncertainty, yet rarely encountered stories that remained consistent across many tellers from distant regions. Slowly, descriptions of this peculiar sea began appearing on the maps they created, becoming part of a world that grew more intricate with each passing year. Although they did not know whether the stories were true products of disorientation or something else entirely. The mapmakers recorded them because every possibility was a step toward understanding a world that could never be fully known. You may imagine how a single line drawn across the parchment became a symbol of something suspended between reality and imagination. Something that might not exist yet held an undeniable place in the human mind. As the following centuries witnessed the rise of more systematic methods of navigation, sailors no longer relied solely on spoken tales to understand the edges of the world. Yet, even as the compass became more reliable and latitude calculations were carried out with increasing precision, the stories of the sea that was to come did not disappear. You may imagine young captains taking charge of their first voyages sitting quietly while older sailors recalled journeys through a region they believed held an indescribable strangeness. Among the sounds of masts clanging and hulls creaking, they spoke of a sky that seemed unchanged for days, as if time itself moved with a different rhythm when passing through that place. Some travel journals written later did not explicitly mention the line or long path described in older accounts, but they repeated a similar impression of unusual silence. The water was not only calm, but seemed devoid of the life usually present in open seas. Birds were rarely seen, fish appeared to avoid the region, and the wind moved in ways difficult to explain through ordinary seafaring experience. Mapmakers of that period began to notice that reports about the area never mentioned storms or high waves. Instead, its stillness was what raised suspicion. You can sense how cartographers attempted to place this phenomenon within the growing framework of scientific understanding. Some suggested the region might lie above deep, stable currents that smoothed the surface into glass-like calm. Others proposed that extreme atmospheric changes might occur far below visibility, leaving the surface strangely unmoved. Yet the more theories they proposed, the clearer it became that every explanation left a portion untouched by direct observation. The phenomenon remained suspended between science and speculation. Eventually, the story of the unusually symmetrical sea entered discussions among scholars who attempted to build a more complete picture of the world. They placed the phenomenon alongside other reports of constant western winds and currents that traveled in straight lines across entire seasons. For some, it became an example of how the world did not always align with patterns that human knowledge could fully explain. You may imagine how a small note about a silent sea added another layer to their understanding of the earth, a reminder that even amid the rapid growth of intellectual thought, certain quiet spaces continued to resist complete explanation. As the era of large-scale transoceanic voyages began, explorers from various kingdoms returned with increasingly detailed accounts of the earth and the seas they encountered. Yet, even as more regions were successfully charted, the story of the overly symmetrical sea remained difficult to dismiss. You may imagine sailors returning from long journeys being asked to sit with cosmographers and mapmakers to recount every detail they remembered. Among descriptions of new coasts and seasonal winds, there were always one or two brief remarks about a section of sea that seemed unlike any other. They did not describe any particular danger, nor did they speak of an ominous atmosphere. What they emphasized instead was a sense of detachment from the familiar world, as if they were passing through a space that did not follow the usual rhythm of the earth. Some official reports preserved in royal archives also recorded difficulties in measuring wind direction when ships entered the region. Compass needles sometimes moved slightly slower than usual, as though a subtle hesitation interrupted each shift. Young navigators were initially thought to be making technical mistakes, but when similar reports emerged from other voyages, scholars began to take them more seriously. They attempted to identify weather patterns or atmospheric conditions that might influence the behavior of navigational instruments, yet every effort to reach a single explanation ended in uncertainty. There were no magnetic storms ever reported, nor any indication of geological features capable of affecting the magnetic field. The phenomenon remained a question that could not be completely set aside. In the study rooms where scholars worked to assemble a more coherent picture of the world, the strange sea began to be discussed in greater depth. They reviewed old stories and compared them with more modern voyage accounts. You can see how they tried to situate the phenomenon between two possibilities. On one hand, it could be an unusual natural anomaly that simply produced extraordinary stillness. On the other hand, its presence seemed to resonate with the mysterious patterns mentioned since the time when world maps were filled with empty spaces. For some, the anomaly illustrated that knowledge did not always advance in a straight path toward certainty. At times, it curved following routes that could not be explained by improvements in instruments or methods. In this way, the sea that was to calm slowly became a symbol of the limits of human understanding, something that could not be erased from the record yet, could not be declared as fact. As more ships set sail toward new regions, mapmakers began to realize that the oddities reported by sailors were not merely peripheral tales. They discovered that accounts of the overly symmetrical sea did not appear only in northern waters, but were also found in records from voyages heading west and south. You may imagine geographers sitting in rooms filled with rolled parchment, trying to match the lines drawn by sailors from different kingdoms. Each line added to the map seemed to deepen the puzzle rather than clarify it. At times, the routes traced by sailors stopped abruptly, as though they had reached a boundary they could not describe. In other cases, the routes curved strangely, following directions that did not correspond with any known current or wind pattern. During several official meetings, scholars questioned captains about what truly occurred when they entered what they entered, what they described as the overly calm sea. Strangely, their explanations were always similar, even though they came from different regions and backgrounds. They claimed to feel a subtle shift, as if the world itself had paused its breath. The sound of the sea softened more than usual. Even the waves moved with a pattern that felt too deliberate. Some said that the view of the horizon became slightly blurred, not due to fog or weather, but as if a thin layer was filtering the light. You may imagine a silence that did not threaten, yet created an unease, as though one were passing through a space positioned between one world and another. Researchers attempting to explain the phenomenon began gathering data from multiple sources. They checked astronomical records to ensure no celestial event could influence ocean behavior. They reviewed weather logs, examined wind patterns, and even considered the possibility of unknown deep currents. Yet each attempt produced more questions than answers. There was no clear link between the reports and seasonal changes, nor any indication that the region possessed unique physical characteristics. The phenomenon remained a blank point within many efforts to understand it. Slowly, many scholars accepted that the mysterious sea might never be fully explained. Yet they also recognized that uncertainty itself gave the phenomenon its significance. In a world endlessly trying to arrange knowledge into tidy structures, places like this served as reminders that the Earth did not entirely obey human attempts to categorize it. You may imagine mapmakers marking that area with lines drawn more softly than usual, as if acknowledging that what they depicted existed on the threshold between reality and possibility. As mapmakers continued their attempt to construct a more complete image of their world, they found that reports of the overly calm sea could no longer be dismissed. Every new record that arrived, even when originating from different voyages, always revealed the same pattern. You may imagine scholars sitting for long hours before a long table filled with ink, fine brushes, and carefully stretched parchment. They revisited each report, trying to find gaps or inconsistencies that might explain the phenomenon as mere coincidence. Yet the longer they studied it, the more they realized the stories held a consistency impossible to attribute to imagination alone. In time, they began to notice small details previously overlooked. Some sailors reported that the sky above the sea appeared clearer than in other regions, as though dust or moisture refused to linger there. Others noted that their compasses rotated slowly without pointing toward any stable direction, as if the magnetic field behaved differently from the rest of the world. You may sense how scholars try to determine whether these occurrences were signs of an unrecognized natural process or evidence that the sailors had entered a region lying beyond the limits of medieval geographical understanding. Certain records describe the CS color as slightly darker than usual, not because of depth, but as if a thin layer rested on the surface, absorbing light. This made scholars question whether the region might be an area where deep currents collided perfectly, creating a surface devoid of random motion. Yet this theory never satisfied them, because experienced sailors insisted they felt none of the turbulence that typically accompanies such underwater interactions. There were no clashing waves, no muffled roaring, no movement, suggesting turmoil from below. Eventually, some scholars proposed that the sea might not be merely a geographical location, but a threshold phenomenon, a space, position between known territory and land, never reached by humans. You may imagine how such a theory disturbed those who desired measurable and conventional explanations. But for others, the idea added a layer of elegance to the mystery, because they believed the world always preserved places that challenged human curiosity. In the quiet of their workrooms, the mapmakers ultimately chose to mark the region carefully. They did not depict it as land or as a dangerous stretch of water, but as an area indicated with soft lines, a symbol that the world of their time was larger than the understanding available to them. As time passed, the mapmakers began to realize that the stories of the unnaturally calm sea did not come solely from sailors or explorers, but also appeared in subtler forms. Some monks responsible for copying ancient manuscripts claimed to have found faint notes describing Topian Auge, a body of water that did not reflect starlight normally. These notes appeared in manuscripts older than the kingdom's commissioning maps in their own era. You may imagine how the mapmakers paused upon hearing this, because for them, the presence of such a note scattered across vast stretches of history suggested that the phenomenon was not a momentary misperception. It sparked long discussions about how collective memory preserves nearly forgotten details that resurface only when historical conditions allow them to return. During their periodic meetings, the scholars explored the possibility that the sea had once been part of an older body of knowledge. That slowly faded as political centers shifted and learning traditions changed. They considered the idea that ancient cultures might have possessed deeper understanding of ocean currents or atmospheric conditions, but that knowledge disappeared before it could be fully recorded. You may sense how their workroom atmosphere turned contemplative because such theories addressed not only geography, but also the loss of human knowledge over generations. Some of the more daring scholars even wondered whether the ancient notes implied that the Gom Sea once served as a boundary of the world or as an entrance to a region not meant to be crossed. They did not state this openly, but you may feel from the quiet exchanges of their glances that they were considering another possibility. The idea that humanity in earlier eras may have understood the world differently and perhaps more expansively than official history assumes. Yet the mapmakers knew they could not incorporate such speculation directly into their work. They needed to maintain balance between curiosity and scientific responsibility. Thus, they stored every unprovable theory within private notes and included only the most aesthetic confirmation in the official map. Even so, this decision made the calm sea appear even more mysterious because it was represented only with soft patterned lines without any explanation whether the place was dangerous, forbidden, or simply an unexplained natural phenomenon. In this way, the map became not only an instrument of navigation, but also a reflection of human limitation and aspiration, a reminder that the world of that time contained many blank spaces that stirred imagination while demanding caution. As newly drawn maps began circulating through trade centers and small ports along the northern coast, the presence of the calm sea marked in gentle lines slowly stirred wider curiosity. Ship captains who received these maps often spent more time gazing at that marked region than at their actual travel routes. You may imagine them standing on deck at night, watching the sea shift color hour by hour, while wondering whether the zone depicted by the mapmakers truly existed or was merely an inherited echo of older fears. Some captains admitted that before seeing the map, they had never considered that the sea might contain boundaries invisible to the eye yet. Now they began observing the waters with different attention. Merchants who approached the world more practically regarded the marked area as a potential threat to trade routes. They wanted clarity on whether the region should be avoided or whether it might be safely crossed. Such discussions frequently arose in harbor markets while merchants waited for their goods to be loaded. In those conversations, you may sense practical reasoning meeting curiosity that gradually transformed into speculation. Some argued that the calm sea could simply be a stable meteorological zone that posed no danger. Others warned that too many reports mentioned wandering compasses and starlight that failed to reflect properly, perhaps indicating something far more complex than weather alone. Meanwhile, monks and archivists who had long worked only to preserve manuscripts grew increasingly intrigued by the spread of the story. They observed how a small symbol on the corner of a map could spark conversations about a world they had previously known only through text. You may imagine them seated among shelves filled with rolled manuscripts, debating whether humanity of that age was on the verge of rediscovering something once known before the world changed. To them, the mystery of the calm sea was not merely about geography, but also about the movement of knowledge which drifted, like a subtle current, able to vanish without warning. All these varied reactions eventually returned to the mapmakers through letters and spoken reports from distant ports. From their perspective, this only confirmed that the region needed to remain on the maps, not as a claim, but as a reminder that the world they charted still held space for unanswered questions. They understood that a map was not simply a collection of lines and place names, but a record of how humans attempted to recognize the boundaries of what they knew. Thus, the calm sea became more than a small feature drawn on the map. It evolved into a symbol of how information travels through society and how curiosity can grow into new understanding even without definitive proof. In the years that followed, attention toward the unusually calm sea gradually shifted from mere curiosity to a form of early research carried out with the limited means available at the time. You may imagine sailors returning from long voyages, sitting with manuscript scribes in dim rooms lit only by oil lamps. They retraced their routes with hands trembling from fatigue while trying to recall details often blurred after weeks of harsh winds and unforgiving sunlight. On rough wooden tables, the scribes attempted to mark portions of their journeys that matched the strange patterns previously recorded. In this way, they slowly built a small body of data, incomplete yet persistent enough to reveal a pattern impossible to ignore. Some reports mention that seabirds, which normally followed ships in search of scraps, would vanish whenever a vessel neared the suspected region of the calm sea. Experienced sailors considered this odd because the birds usually learned how to take advantage of human presence. Other records described a sudden drop in air temperature, even when the surrounding weather remained stable. These observations encouraged scholars and monasteries to consider whether the phenomenon might relate to shifts in the Earth's magnetic field, or to some other factor they lacked the scientific vocabulary to describe. There were also accounts based on personal experience, such as the sense of lost time reported by several crew members. They claimed that their hourglasses seemed to run slower or faster, as though time in the region followed an uneven rhythm. Although manuscript scribes were cautious about recording details that seemed overly subjective, they still included them because similar stories emerged, repeatedly from sources who had never met. You may sense how this uncertainty created a quiet tension among scholars who tried to determine whether these accounts were psychological effects of long voyages or hints of something deeper. Ultimately, the growing collection of information led mapmakers to consider adding a small note beside the region of the calm sea. The note would not explain the phenomenon, but would instead state that the area remained poorly understood and required further observation. To them, such an acknowledgement was not a weakness, but a sign of respect for the uncertainties that shaped the world of their era. In this way, maps became more than navigational tools. They became vessels for collective memory, recording the edges of human understanding. You may imagine how this notion brought a strange sense of calm, as though the world itself was waiting for humanity to find a rhythm of exploration that matched its mysteries. As reports about the unnaturally calm sea continued to accumulate, scholars began to wonder whether the phenomenon might be connected to migration patterns or subtle shifts in climate that they lacked the means to fully understand. You may imagine a small group of monks sitting in the monastery garden quietly observing the movement of clouds and the changes in wind direction that they recorded day by day. Though they had no instruments capable of measuring atmospheric conditions with precision, they still kept detailed notes of every small change they noticed. In the long silence of the afternoon, they compared these simple observations to the accounts of sailors, hoping to discover whether the sea in question was a natural anomaly or something far more intricate. Some scholars suspected that the region might lie at a transitional point where two major wind systems collided, creating an unusual zone of stillness. Yet this theory was never fully accepted because the sailors' descriptions indicated contrasts far stronger than any wind interaction could produce. There were no sudden shifts in air pressure, no hints of nearing storms, no signs of the large waves that often accompany weather transitions. Instead, what they encountered was a stillness too perfect, as though sea and sky had momentarily agreed to suspend all movement. There were also reports describing the smell of the air in that region. Some sailors said the breeze felt cleaner and colder, yet carried a faint scent that was difficult to define, like metal touched by rain or wet stone under moonlight. Scholars tried to match this with known natural processes, but found no satisfying explanation. You may sense how this subtle scent became another small piece of the larger puzzle, a hint that the region possessed not only unusual visual qualities, but its own sensory identity. Meanwhile, mapmakers attempted to integrate all this information into a more coherent picture. They added small notes about the change in sea color, the disappearance of birds, and the hourglasses that refused to keep steady time. To them, every detail held value because the world of their era was not captured through certainty, but through the patterns that emerged from shared experience. You may imagine how they drew soft lines over the parchment, not with absolute confidence, but with a quiet respect for a mystery they could not resolve. By this stage, opinions among scholars began to diverge. Some believed the sea was simply a natural phenomenon waiting for a better explanation. Others felt the region marked a boundary of the known world. Yet all agreed that the sea could not be reduced to an ordinary tale. It required a place on the map, a place in the records, a place in the memory of the time. As though the world itself was concealing something waiting for generations more prepared to uncover it. As the number of records about the Silent Sea grew, scholars at the monastery began turning their attention to the small objects sailors carried back when they reached the harbor. You may imagine monks gathering around a long wooden table covered with strands of wet rope-like fragments of wood that seemed to have drifted from unknown directions, and grains of salt clinging to metal surfaces as though they came from a sea, not entirely like ordinary seas. They examined each object with gentle patience, attempting to identify patterns within what appeared to be complete randomness. In the quiet of the archive room, the only sound was the soft scratching of quills, noting small findings, such as the faint bluish tint of the salt, or the unusually smooth texture of the wood, as though polished by something other than human hands. Some sailors reported that the drifting wood carried a faint aroma, reminding them of frozen grass that appears in the northern lands during winter. This startled the scholars because the sea in question lay far from any region touched by winter winds. You may sense how their confusion slowly transformed into deep curiosity as the monks tried to determine whether the scent was a clue to a strange climate in that region, or whether the wood originated from a place they had not yet imagined. Small metal objects brought back by sailors also showed unusual shifts in color. Not the red or green corrosion expected from seawater exposure, but a much softer transformation, resembling a thin layer of ash that would form only if the metal had been heated by a steady flame. The scholars wondered whether this was caused by the chemical nature of the water, or whether the objects had passed through some natural process unknown to them. As they studied these pieces, the monastery felt like a room where time slowed because each second was spent examining the smallest details. One of the most perplexing notes came from a sailor who claimed that when he touched the water of the region, he felt a deep coldness against his skin, yet not a painful one. He described the sensation as touching a stone kept inside a dark cave for many years. The scholars did not accept this easily, but the record was preserved because they knew that repeated details in multiple accounts could hold significance. You may sense how this coldness gradually became part of the larger narrative. They were assembling a small sign of a region that seemed to possess a life of its own. In the end, the scholars realized that these small objects were not merely tokens of voyage, but openings into a deeper understanding of the aquiline sea, whose mysteries remained intact. Although none of the objects offered definitive answers, they shared one important characteristic. They revealed that the world was far wider and more intricate than what the maps of the age could capture. As if the region itself was sending a soft message through these tiny fragments, a message they had yet to fully decipher. As scholars continued gathering records about the small objects brought by sailors, their attention slowly shifted to reports of time behaving strangely in that silent sea. You may imagine monks and mapmakers sitting together in a candle-lit workspace, arranging hourglasses of various sizes. They wrote down accounts from sailors who claimed their hourglasses sometimes slowed without explanation. Although an hourglass is a simple instrument usually trusted for its consistency, the scholars believed, but even minor irregularities in the flow of sand might hold important clues. In that cautious atmosphere, they recorded how long the sand should take to descend and how long sailors claimed it had stalled, as though the grains hesitated. Midway down the narrow passage, several sailors described that while crossing the region, the hourglasses did not fully stop, but flowed in patterns that seemed unnatural. At times, the sand descended normally, then suddenly slowed, only to recover minutes later. The scholars attempted to explain this phenomenon as an effect of cabin humidity or the ship's movement. Yet such reasoning was unsatisfying because many reports described the sea as perfectly calm with little to no wind and therefore no movement strong enough to disrupt the sand. You may sense the scholars' growing perplexity as they began to understand that the silence reported by sailors did not affect only sound or waves, but perhaps the perception of time itself. In addition to the hourglasses, some sailors mentioned unusual distortions in the shadows cast by sunlight on the surface of the sea. They noted that the shadows of their sails appeared slightly longer or shorter than expected, even though the position of the sun seemed normal. Scholars tried to determine whether this was due to changes in the water's color or whether the sunlight behaved differently in that region. You may imagine them adjusting the angle of lamps in the workroom, trying to replicate the reported distortions, yet none of their experiments produced anything close to what the sailors described. The scholars eventually began to suspect that the unusual behavior of time and light in that region was not caused by weather or physical conditions alone, but might have resulted from an undocumented interaction between the sea's atmosphere and subtle changes within the Earth itself. A quiet idea formed in their minds perhaps the region was a place where the laws of nature moved with a slightly different rhythm. You may feel how this idea grew slowly, like a seed in the shade. They reached no final conclusion, but agreed that the silent sea held qualities that the simple instruments of their era could not fully capture. At this stage, the records of hourglasses, shadows, and shifting light became essential in their attempt to understand the mysterious sea. All these observations suggested that its secrets did not rest solely on the surface, but also within the very way humans experienced it. As though the sea shaped space and time according to its own design, while waiting for someone patient enough to recognize its pattern. As scholars continued reviewing the sailors' reports, their attention slowly turned to another phenomenon that appeared repeatedly: the subtle change in the behavior of marine animals crossing the region. You may imagine monks and mapmakers seated in the monastery reading hall, analyzing accounts of seabirds that usually followed ships, but suddenly refused to approach a certain area. These birds often served as natural guides, able to sense shifts in wind and movement with remarkable precision. Yet the sailors described them halting their pursuit long before the ships entered the unnaturally calm waters, as if sensing something humans could not perceive. Some reports stated that fish, which normally swam near the surface, disappeared entirely as the ships approached the region, as though they chose to retreat into unseen depths. Scholars searched for explanations involving water, temperature, or deep current shifts, but the sailors insisted the surface was far too stable to indicate any significant underwater movement. You may sense the scholars' growing curiosity as they realize that the animals who usually serve as natural indicators of the sea displayed reactions contradicting. what one would expect from calm waters. Other accounts described a thin bluish film that occasionally adhered to the sides of ships for a few minutes before dissolving back into the sea. Sailors reported it as a soft layer with no noticeable scent and causing no harm, yet they recorded it because it appeared only in that quiet region. Scholars compared it with known marine organisms, but found no convincing match. You may imagine them sketching the faint texture of the film onto parchment and storing it among their observation archives. As the data accumulated, mapmakers began to suspect that the behavior of marine animals might serve as the most honest indicator of the region's nature. They understood that animals respond to their environment in ways far more subtle than humans, and their reactions could be the earliest hint of what lay behind the silence of those waters. You may feel their awareness growing that the mystery of the sea was not solely tied to its physical properties, but also to how it interacted with the life around it. In the end, scholars agreed that although the reports about marine animals seemed simple, they carried great importance. They gathered these records into a dedicated list they called the Catalogue of Biological Phenomena of the Silent Region. Unbeknownst to them, this collection became one of the first clues suggesting that the sea was not an empty space, but a realm with its own character influencing everything that moved across and within it. As though the sea had developed its own quiet way of deciding what could approach and what should stay away. As scholars began merging biological records with visual observations of the unnaturally calm sea, they discovered yet another pattern that deepened the mystery surrounding the region. You may imagine them reopening notebooks already yellowed with age searching for signs of seasonal shifts or wind changes that might coincide with reports of voyages through the area. Yet they found the opposite because the descriptions of the region appeared free from influence by any season or time of year. Sailors described identical conditions whether they traveled in the heavy sky of winter or in the warm summer months when gentle winds typically stirred small waves across the sea. The stillness of the region did not change, as though it remained untouched by the natural cycles that shaped the rest of the world. The scholars then turned to accounts of travel duration. In some reports, journeys that should have taken less time suddenly stretched far longer without storms or visible obstacles. Sailors described their ships as moving, yet feeling slowed, as if held back by an unseen force. Meanwhile, other reports noted journeys that were completed faster than expected, as though the ships glided through the region with unnatural ease. You may sense the scholars attempting to uncover a pattern within these irregularities, only to find that the sea refused any form of consistency. There were also descriptions of subtle changes in sound experienced by the sailors. Some reported that the splashing of water around the ship sounded softer than usual, as if cushioned by an invisible layer. Others said the surface of the sea no longer produced echoes, making them feel as though they were speaking in an open space, lacking walls to reflect their voices. These accounts led the scholars to question whether the region was a natural acoustic anomaly or if the structure of its surface differed fundamentally from other seas. In their attempt to make sense of these phenomena, scholars began imagining the region not as a place with a single cause, but as a wide zone whose qualities emerged only under certain conditions. You may sense how they approached the region as though it were a living presence with its own tendencies, sometimes slowing ships, sometimes releasing them, sometimes absorbing sound, sometimes allowing it to travel freely. Eventually, they realized that to represent this region on a map, they needed to leave space for possibilities they could not define. With this understanding, the map makers added small notes explaining that the region exerted unpredictable effects on time movement and sound. Though simple, these notes became one of the most honest acknowledgments that the world of their time still contained spaces that exceeded their ability to name or comprehend. As though the sea was not merely a location, but a sign of the boundary of human awareness, which always moved slower than the vastness of the world they sought to understand. When researchers expanded their study to the mineralogical records from ships that had crossed the region, they discovered something that further teased the strangeness of the Silent Sea. Some vessels returned with salt crystals clinging to their hulls in unusual formations, not spreading horizontally as expected, but growing in tiny helix-like shapes that seemed to twist gently. You may imagine geologists examining those crystals with care, comparing them to known formations from tropical waters or cold seas. Yet they found that the helix shapes did not match crystallization processes influenced by temperature, pressure, or evaporation rates. It was as though the water of the region possessed its own rhythm for shaping minerals, capturing traces of each passing disturbance in ways the scholars did not fully understand. There were also records describing subtle changes in scent while crossing the area. Sailors wrote that the air smelled not of salt as expected, but of moist soil reminiscent of a forest untouched by sunlight. Scholars attempted to determine whether the scent was linked to underwater volcanic activity or pockets of organic gas, yet no evidence supported such explanations. The accounts lingered like questions without direction. You may picture the scholars wondering whether the aroma did not come from the sea itself, but from an interaction between water vapor and the air above it, producing a molecular mix that created a strange and fleeting sensory effect. Researchers also began examining the migration patterns of seabirds in the region. Certain birds were rarely seen flying low over the silent water, and some records described flocks making wide, unexpected detours to avoid the area. Scholars speculated whether the region possessed an unusual magnetic field or if atmospheric conditions interfered with natural navigation. Yet again, the data offered no clear conclusion. The birds that avoided the region showed no signs of distress and returned to their sooner-usual routes as soon as they had passed its boundaries. They behaved as if the region was not dangerous, but simply unknowable, and therefore better left untouched. Eventually, the scholars realized that the region could not be understood through a single discipline. The phenomena they observed arose from the delicate interplay of biological, mineral, acoustic, and atmospheric elements, and perhaps from something they had no vocabulary for. This realization led them to add new notes to their maps and journals, notes that did not offer explanations but preserved uncertainty. You may sense how they gradually accepted that some parts of the world could only be witnessed, not mastered, by knowledge. The sea remained quiet, not with emptiness, but with a fullness of things that never entirely revealed themselves. As scholars revisited scattered records from different centuries, they realized that the phenomenon of the unnaturally calm sea did not appear only in scientific documents, but also in personal travel notes, journals of young sailors, and even meditative writings of monks who had never sailed. Each account came from a different perspective, yet all converged toward the same depiction of a region that seemed to resist the normal patterns governing the world's waters. You may imagine the scholars sitting together, reading aloud texts found in small libraries, dim archival rooms, or monastery basements that held fragile old scrolls. The more texts they gathered, the clearer it became that the region was not merely a natural anomaly, but a cross-generational experience returning again and again without yielding a consistent explanation. Some of the oldest accounts described how time appeared to move with an unusual rhythm in that region. Monks who had never seen the sea wrote meditative reflections influenced by sailors. Stories as though the slow bending of time in that region could be sensed from afar. Sailors wrote that their hourglasses refused to behave properly, the grains of sand seeming to pause before falling. Scholars attempted to compare these reports with known natural effects, such as extreme humidity or pressure changes, but found no mention of such conditions. What remained were descriptions of time moving in ways unaligned with ordinary patterns. Other documents contain testimonies about subtle changes in the color of light touching the sea's surface. Some said sunlight dimmed without the presence of clouds, while others described the moon appearing larger or paler when the region was crossed. Scholars searched for astronomical explanations, but found no dependable pattern. Light seemed to behave like a living presence, adjusting itself to the sea's rhythm, sometimes sinking softly beneath the surface, sometimes reflecting farther than the angles of illumination could explain. With so many accounts that refused a single coherent pattern, scholars began to see the region as a place where human perception slipped out of alignment with the physical world. They did not interpret the phenomenon as supernatural, but as a reminder of how limited human senses were when encountering conditions at the edge of understanding. You may sense how the scholars slowly accepted that the sea invited questions rather than answers, questions that continued to multiply. In the end, they compiled notes describing the region as one that influenced not only movement, sound, time, or light, but also the very way humans comprehended their own existence. As though the region was not merely part of the world, but a reflection of the shifting boundary of human knowledge which moved, even as people tried to grasp it. As scholars continued their efforts to understand the unnaturally calm sea, they began to see that the phenomenon could not be explained solely through travel accounts or observational records. They realized they needed to reconsider how people of the time perceived space, distance, and the boundaries of the world. You may imagine them sitting in a wide room whose walls were lined with old maps, faded with age. They examined not only shorelines and wind patterns, but also how the human mind interpreted the world when information depended entirely on the senses and memory. In that quiet, they wondered whether the region was not merely a physical location, but a perceptual space arising when humans encountered something they could not define. Some scholars combed through records that blended direct experience with personal reflection. They found writings describing how sailors felt as though they were in a space wider than what the horizon revealed. There were notes stating that the sky felt farther away, as if the distance between sea and cloud had stretched. The scholars tried to understand these descriptions not as metaphor, but as traces of how humans sense spatial change when faced with a region that defies normal expectations. You may imagine them documenting every subtle impression, realizing that human understanding of space does not always match measurable dimensions. In several reports, sailors also described changes in bodily rhythm. They wrote of breathing that felt different sometimes, longer, sometimes shallower, despite no change in weather. Some said they felt lighter, as if the weight of their own bodies had lessened, even though the sea was calm and the ship unmoving. Scholars began to consider that the region might influence internal perception, the ways bodies sense motion, heaviness, and time. They did not regard this as beyond nature, but as evidence that human physiology might respond to conditions that had yet to be recognized. Eventually, the scholars formed the idea that the region might be one of those rare spaces where the boundary between the external world and human perception becomes blurred. The sea was not just a location on a map, but a point where physical and inner experience converged. You may feel how this understanding offered them a new perspective, that to comprehend the region, they needed to understand not only the sea, but also how humans sensed their own existence. With this awareness, the map makers added more delicate notes to their maps, not to explain, but to acknowledge that the region affected not only the environment, but also the way people read the world. These quiet annotations became reminders that some places expand not only the edges of maps, but also the boundaries of what could be understood at the time. As scholars attempted to expand their understanding of the unnaturally calm sea, they began to re-examine the relationship between time and space within the context of medieval seafaring. You may imagine them seated at a long table scattered with rolled maps, small hourglasses, and navigation notes written in ink that had begun to fade. They realized that many sailors reported similar experiences regarding the shifting rhythm of time while crossing the region. Hourglasses that should have run steadily sometimes appeared slower, and sometimes faster, as though the grains of sand no longer obeyed the familiar rules of movement. The scholars did not accept these accounts as absolute truth, yet they could not dismiss them because such reports came from different sailors across different periods. Some scholars considered whether an unusual underwater current or structural pattern in the water might influence sailors' perception of time. Yet this theory quickly faltered because sailors did not feel the physical changes that generally accompany such currents. The ships remained steady even as their hourglasses behaved strangely. You may sense the scholars struggling to understand whether the phenomenon belonged to the physical world or to human psychology when confronted with a place that defied natural expectations. Other records describe shadows that lengthened unexpectedly as ships passed through the region, even though the position of the sun had not shifted significantly. Sailors wrote of how their own shadows felt heavier or lighter, as though something in the light itself had changed. Scholars attempted to connect this to humidity, solar angle, or the reflection of sunlight on an unusually flat sea surface. Yet no explanation fully resolved the mystery, each theory ending only in deeper uncertainty. Some scholars began to ask whether time in the region flowed in a way that could not be directly perceived. They did not claim that time literally changed, but rather that humans might lose their sense of temporal rhythm in a place lacking the usual visual or auditory cues that anchor the passage of a day. You may imagine how perfect stillness could cause humans to feel time shifting. The absence of waves, birds, or wind leaves one dependent solely on the body to measure presence in the world. In the end, the scholars decided the region must be recorded as a place where human perception of time became unsettled. Not in a dangerous way, but in a way that reminded them that human understanding does not always align with the nature of the world itself. With this realization, the mapmakers added a gentle note stating that the sea possessed a rhythm of its own, mysterious yet undeniable. It remained a mark of a world that was wider, quieter, and more enigmatic than any instrument of the era could measure. As scholars continued to examine the records related to that strange stretch of sea, they realized that the sailors' experiences were not limited to distortions of time or shifts in light, but also involved sensations rising from the objects around them. You may imagine sailors noting that the wood of their ships felt colder even when warm weather surrounded their journey. Some described touching the ship's walls, which were usually warm under the sun, yet in that region felt as though coated with morning dew. The scholars attempted to link this sensation to temperature changes in the water, but calculations showed no meaningful difference compared to surrounding regions. This led them to reconsider whether the place influenced human sensory perception rather than presenting a purely physical anomaly. Some scholars noted reports of sound seemingly vanishing upon entering the region. You may picture a sailor tapping the wooden rail only to hear a muted response where a clear tone should have echoed. Even the small waves brushing the hull seemed to quiet themselves before reaching the sailor's ears. They described a feeling as though the world had suddenly severed its ties with resonance. Scholars investigated whether this could be caused by air density or extreme stillness, but their measurements did not support such explanations. No physical change could account for the missing sound, prompting them to suggest that the region disrupted sound waves in an unusual way. Other accounts described subtle changes in the taste of food. Bread that was normally soft felt heavier in the mouth. Water carried aboard tasted flatter, as though stripped of character. Scholars hesitated to dismiss these details because many reports came from unrelated crews across different eras. They considered the possibility that absolute stillness influenced the human body. Processing of sensory input, making flavors slower, softer, or strangely persistent. Some scholars eventually felt that the region was not simply a quiet part of the world, but a place that challenged human perception itself. You may sense how carefully they wrote their conclusions, suggesting that the region was not dangerous, but placed travelers on the threshold of perception rarely touched in everyday life. They described it as a space where the world loosened its grip on the small details that normally anchor human experience. With this view, mapmakers added a gentle note, stating that the sea tested the senses, yet remained welcoming to those who crossed it. Their wording conveyed that the world was not only vast, but capable of offering spaces that embraced travelers in a way both unfamiliar and calming. As scholars expanded their analysis of the mysterious region, they began to re-examine the small objects brought back from ships that had crossed it. You may imagine them sitting quietly in a candlelit research chamber holding compasses, metal needles, and fragments of sailcloth carried home as evidence. One of the first things they noticed was that the compass needles did not point wildly in the wrong direction, but instead trembled with an unusual rhythm. The vibration was subtle yet repetitive, forming a pattern as if the needle were resisting two directions at once. Scholars recognized that this was different from the magnetic disturbances typically caused by natural metals or seabed formations, so they reviewed all available travel logs to confirm that no underwater mountain range existed in that region. Some scholars focused on how sailcloth from ships that passed through the area showed changes in texture that were difficult to explain. Cloth that was normally coarse from salt exposure felt softer and more flexible, as if the region had allowed it to absorb moisture without becoming wet. Sailors described how the sails became easier to pull, yet lost their shape more quickly in the wind. Scholars attempted to connect this to trapped humidity, but tests on the returned cloth revealed no significant differences. This led them to consider that the changes may have been temporary, occurring only while ships were physically within that region. Other records described ropes loosening unexpectedly despite being tightly secured. You may imagine a sailor examining a line that should have been tense, yet felt as though it had lost the energy that held it taut. Scholars searched for consistent patterns, but the results were unsatisfying. The phenomenon occurred randomly across different ships and showed no relation to the type of wood used, wind direction, or weather conditions. Scholars began to write that the region might subtly affect the physical tension of objects in ways not explainable by the science of their age. In the end, scholars concluded that the sea did not merely disrupt human perception, but produced gentle alterations in physical objects. Nothing was damaged or dangerous, yet the changes were enough to make sailors wonder whether the world in that place for a brief moment followed different laws. You may sense how cautiously the mapmakers added this to their annotations. They inscribed a small note describing the sea as a place that could shift tension, texture, and direction without harm. The note read like a whisper drawn along the edge of the map, as though the world wished to remind travelers that some places do not obey human logic, yet still welcome their presence with quiet serenity. As research into the region deepened, scholars began focusing on subtle changes in the behavior of sea animals reported by sailors. You may imagine them reading through pages filled with sketches of fish, seabirds, and small marine creatures that usually indicate the health of a body of water. Yet in this region, the sailors describe something different because the animals seem to alter their patterns as if reacting to something unseen. Fish that normally moved in tight formations suddenly scattered and swam erratically. Seabirds that typically followed ships from afar vanished once the vessel crossed into the region, as though reluctant to go farther. Scholars considered whether the animals were responding to changes in water temperature, yet temperature records collected over centuries showed no unusual variations. Some sailors reported that the sounds produced by underwater life also diminished. When lowering buckets into the sea, they usually heard faint echoes from fish or currents, yet in this region, those sounds softened or disappeared entirely. Scholars wondered whether layers of sediment could dampen sound, but found no evidence. You may sense how the more the scholars searched, the more they came to believe that the region affected creatures more deeply than it affected humans. Other accounts mention certain animals appearing more frequently. Sailors described large gatherings of jellyfish drifting more slowly than usual, as though suspended in denser water. There were also sightings of small, pale fish seen only once in a lifetime. Scholars attempted to link these appearances to migration patterns or environmental conditions, yet every explanation ended with greater uncertainty. In the end, scholars realized that sea animals seemed to serve as more sensitive indicators of the region's presence than humans. You may imagine scholars attempting to follow the movement patterns of these creatures, hoping to map an invisible structure shaping the area. Yet each time they felt close to understanding it, the region returned to its familiar stillness. Mapmakers later added a note that the area was known for unusual animal behavior. This small annotation became a quiet reminder that mystery exists not only for humans, but also for the tiny creatures who live by laws of nature far more intricate than human understanding. As scholars examined sailors' accounts describing changes in the quality of light over the unnaturally calm sea, they found striking similarities, despite the reports coming from different centuries and regions. You may imagine them spreading these accounts across a long table, searching for patterns that might bind these observations together. Many sailors wrote that sunlight in that region appeared softer, as though filtered through a thin veil that dimmed the sea's reflection. At times, the light carried a tint of green or pale blue unseen in other waters. Scholars attempted to link this to airborne particles or atmospheric conditions, but weather records showed no significant variations that could support such explanations. Some sailors reported that the light seemed to possess a direction of its own. Shadows grew longer, even though the sun's position should not have produced such effects. Others noted that the light appeared to move in subtle waves, as if following a rhythm on the surface of the sea, despite the ocean being too still to create shifting reflections. You may sense how these observations led scholars to consider whether the sea surface possessed optical properties not yet understood. Other records described even subtler phenomena. Sailors wrote that the color of the water shifted gradually as their ships crossed the region. Deep blue faded into pale blue, and at times even into a soft, silvery sheen. These changes were not accompanied by wave movement or biological activity, leading scholars to doubt that living organisms were the cause. They instead considered whether the surface structure of the water could bend light differently from other regions. Yet this theory also lacked evidence because no tools existed at the time to study optical effects in detail. In their attempt to make sense of these changes, scholars began imagining the region as a space with unstable visual qualities. Light in this area seemed to lose certainty in both direction and strength. You may imagine them debating whether the light itself changed or whether human perception shifted in response to the surrounding stillness. Each report returned them to the same question whether the world behaved differently here, or whether humans simply saw differently when deprived of movement and sound. Ultimately, the scholars reached a conclusion that was honest, but unsatisfying that the light in this region behaved in ways they could not explain. Mapmakers added a note stating that the area possessed unpredictable visual qualities. This note did not clarify the mystery, but instead acknowledged that some parts of the world operated beyond human understanding. As if the light itself urged them to remember that mystery lives not only in the ocean's depths, but also upon its quiet surface, in places where the world refuses to be fully read. When scholars explored whether the shifting light of that region might relate to phenomena mentioned in ancient cultures, they discovered something surprising. Several early civilizations had left vague descriptions of a sea that reflects a sky not its own. These notes appeared in inscriptions, oral poetry, and old maritime traditions, though none pointed clearly to a specific location. You may imagine how scholars traced each of these expressions back through history, attempting to determine whether the ancestors were speaking metaphorically or describing a real stretch of ocean that appeared strange to those who witnessed it. Some ancient texts portrayed light as though it possessed awareness, capable of responding to the presence of humans. One fragment claimed that the light above the sea weakens when the sailor's heart is full of fear, while another described it as a mist that never fully formed. Modern scholars do not accept the idea that light itself has intention, yet they acknowledge that human perception is easily altered by environment, emotion, and cultural framing. Still, the resemblance between ancient remarks and later sailors' reports was striking enough that it could not be dismissed. Interest soon shifted from purely scientific questions to a cross-temporal inquiry into how humans across eras described unusual visual experiences. Scholars began to consider whether the light changes might be not only a physical phenomenon, but also a collective psychological experience passed down across generations. You can imagine them comparing word patterns, metaphor structures, and visual descriptions in old texts to the accounts of sailors who lived centuries later. Some scholars even proposed that the region might once have belonged to an ancient maritime route, now forgotten. If true, then the ancestors of modern sailors may have witnessed the same phenomenon and attempted to describe it with a language of their time, language rich in metaphor, but limited in scientific precision. This raised the possibility that the region had long carried a reputation as a place where light behaved as though freed from ordinary rules. Yet, despite all the historical context uncovered, nothing could explain why the light changed in the same way over thousands of years. Scholars recognized a wide gap between modern knowledge and ancient memory. What remained was the idea that this region had, for generations, made people see the sea not as an empty space, but as a vast mirror reflecting something not yet understood. As though the place preserved a link between past and present through shifting. Light reminding us that the world still holds layers unrevealed to ordinary sight. In their final effort to understand the unnaturally calm sea, scholars decided to combine all previous records: sailors' observations, monastic notes, early scientific reports, and ancient references to light and unusual natural phenomena. You may imagine them sitting for hours in a workspace filled with rolled maps, notebooks, and simple instruments, tracing patterns that might emerge from the combination of all these sources. Each layer of information added dimension to the region, making it increasingly complex and difficult to fully comprehend using conventional methods. They began to realize that the region was not merely a part of physical geography, but also a collective experience arising from the interaction between humans and an extraordinarily unique environment. Passing ships felt unusual calm. Light moved in subtle rhythms. Shadows lengthened or shortened without apparent reason, and time seemed to slow or accelerate depending on the observer's perception. These phenomena were not just technical descriptions, but part of the human way of interpreting a world beyond their knowledge. You may sense how scholars attempted to view the region from a broader perspective, merging science, history, and human experience into a nearly mystical whole. Some scholars even began to imagine the region as a natural laboratory, compelling observers to notice what usually escapes attention. The zone demanded patience and sensitivity to small details: watercolor, wind movement, shimmering light, soft sounds. All these elements formed a unique sensory experience, as if the region were teaching that the world cannot always be measured or contained by instruments and numbers. You may imagine the awe that arose as they realized the region remained mysterious despite careful observation. Ultimately, mapmakers decided to mark the area not as danger or land, but as a zone annotated with subtle notes explaining its uncertainty and unique character. These notes were not merely technical information, but an acknowledgement that humans face part of the world that refused to be fully mastered. You may sense how each line, color, and symbol they added conveyed respect for a mystery that could not be explained while leaving. Space for the imagination of future observers. Thus, the unnaturally calm sea became more than a location on a map. It became a symbol of the relationship between humans and nature, between knowledge and experience, between history and perception. Every note, report, and observation collected over centuries formed a narrative connecting time, space, and human experience, turning the region into a representation of a mystery that continues to challenge human understanding. Over time, the unnaturally calm sea began to gain its own reputation among sailors and early scientists. You may imagine how tales of shifting light, slowed time, and perfect stillness spread from harbor to harbor, from monasteries to marketplaces, forming a network of knowledge, half scientific, half myth. Each sailor crossing the region added their personal experience to the evolving narrative, and mapmakers learned to listen, record, and adapt their representation of the area on parchment. This illustrates how knowledge develops through the accumulation of collective observation and experience, rather than through single theories or experiments. Early scientists began to realize that the region challenged human limits of sight, perception of time, and acoustic sensation. For instance, the sound of waves seemed softened or disappeared entirely. Ship shadows lengthened or shortened, and compasses spun with unusual rhythm. You may sense how these anomalies forced them to reconsider their concept of normality, that the world could possess phenomena that did not conform to known laws, and that human observation is always relative to individual experience. The phenomenon became a lesson for scholars that knowledge must be flexible, and that the world occasionally offers experiences too complex to be fully recorded or explained. Cartographers, exercising caution, began marking the region with symbols emphasizing its uncertainty and unique phenomenal nature. They did not depict it as a hazard, an island, or a particular current, but as a space demanding interpretation and careful attention. Every symbol, note, and fine line added to the map was not merely technical information, but an acknowledgement of the limitations of human understanding. You may imagine how valuable these lines would be to future observers, conveying that the world has layers not directly measurable, but to be experienced and appreciated. Over time, the region became a meeting point between scientific fact and orally transmitted story. People learned that while the area could be charted, the experiences within it could not be fully explained. The continuously changing phenomenal light, shadow, sound, and perception of time offered important lessons about uncertainty and the complexity of the world. You may sense how this region became a symbol of humanity's pursuit of knowledge, a space requiring careful observation, respect for mystery, and awareness that some of the world's secrets remain beyond comprehension. Ultimately, the unnaturally calm sea was more than a geographic location. It became a metaphor for the human relationship with a vast and mysterious world. It demonstrated how knowledge, experience, and imagination combine to create a richer understanding, though never complete. Every note, map, and story collected over centuries formed a collective narrative bridging the past, present, and generations yet to come. At this stage, scholars and mapmakers began to realize that the unnaturally calm sea was not merely a physical space, but also a natural laboratory for human understanding of perception and experience. You may imagine them reflecting over maps, comparing sailors' logs, monks' reports, and visual observations while attempting to find a common thread among anomalies that seemed unrelated. Phenomena such as shifting light, slow time, vanishing sound, and lengthening shadows demonstrated that the region possessed characteristics demanding multidimensional interpretation, combination of science, art, and imagination. Scientists recognize that these phenomena force them to consider the limits of human experience. They began to understand that human perception does not always align with the external world, and that subjective experience can provide insights as significant as objective measurements. For example, hourglasses that appeared to run slower or faster did not alter the laws of physics, but offered insight into how extreme stillness could influence consciousness and the perception of time. You may sense how these observations broaden the concept of knowledge, from mere empirical facts to experiences engaging the entire senses and awareness. Mapmakers, in turn, began expressing this understanding through subtle symbolism. They added fine lines, small notes, and special marks indicating that the region was phenomenal and could not be fully explained. These symbols served not only as navigational guides, but also as philosophical records of human limitations in comprehending the world. You may imagine how valuable these representations were for future observers, who could interpret the region as a place where imagination, experience, and scientific knowledge intersect. The continuously changing phenomena, which could not be replicated or measured consistently, taught scholars the importance of flexibility in scientific thinking. They began to realize that the world cannot always be explained by a single formula or theory. Each new observation added a layer of insight. And the records accumulated over centuries formed a living network of knowledge, albeit incomplete. You may sense how this region became a symbol of humanity's pursuit of understanding, a place where mystery, experience, and curiosity meet, generating knowledge that is adaptive and dynamic. Ultimately, the unnaturally calm sea was understood as a dual entity, physical and conceptual, real and phenomenal. It showed that understanding the world involves not only measurement and observation, but also interpretation, reflection, and appreciation of the unexplained. You may imagine how future generations would study these maps and notes, learning that the world holds places that challenge comprehension, urging humans to continue exploring, observing, and imagining possibilities yet unknown. As records and observations of the unnaturally calm sea continued to accumulate, scholars began to realize that the phenomenon was not merely local, but might have broader implications for human understanding of geography and navigation. You may imagine them sitting for hours, studying maps, logbooks, and astronomical observations while attempting to connect scattered points of information. Phenomena such as extreme stillness, shifting light, lengthening shadows, and altered perceptions of time challenged the foundational principles of navigation and mapping they had long considered stable. Scientists began posing deeper questions. Was this region simply a natural anomaly, or did an unknown law govern the interaction between sea, light, time, and human perception? They considered the possibility of subtle natural patterns, undetectable by medieval instruments, yet discernible through direct experience and collective records. You may sense their persistence as they tried to determine whether these phenomena served as a warning to sailors about the limits of human knowledge or were merely coincidental events repeating over time. Mapmakers began adding more complex symbols, depicting the region with fine lines, shaded areas, and annotations indicating uncertainty. These symbols functioned not only as navigational guides, but also as philosophical reminders. The world contains parts that resist certainty, reminding humans that science and experience do not always align. You may imagine how valuable these records were for future generations, who would come to see maps not merely as practical tools, but as mediums to understand the boundaries of human knowledge. The seemingly inconsistent and shifting phenomena taught scholars the importance of flexibility in thinking and evaluating experience. They began to realize that truly valuable knowledge is not only that which can be measured or proven, but also that which provokes questions and reflection. You may sense how this region became a symbol of humanity's pursuit of understanding, a place where mystery, experience, and curiosity converge to form living, adaptive insight. Ultimately, the unnaturally calm sea came to be regarded as more than a physical location. It was a conceptual and phenomenal space, challenging human comprehension, urging new ways of seeing the world. You may imagine future generations gazing upon these maps and notes, learning that the world holds places requiring patience, careful observation, and the ability to accept uncertainty as part of knowledge. The region served as a reminder that the world can never be fully explained, but it can always be explored and gradually understood. Over time, records of the unnaturally calm sea began to shape the way people perceived maps and geographical knowledge more broadly. You may imagine subsequent generations of mapmakers examining ancient scrolls, studying the fine lines and faint symbols marking the mysterious region. They realized that maps were not merely tools for locating places, but also mediums preserving experience, uncertainty, and the limits of human understanding in their era. The region became a point of contemplation, a space where maps blended fact with sensation, between measurable geography and experiences difficult to articulate. Later, scientists attempted to connect these ancient accounts with modern observations, searching for patterns that might explain the phenomenon through natural laws understood today. Yet the more they studied, the clearer it became that the region retained its silence and uncertainty, resisting categorization into any definite framework. You may sense how scientific rigor met aesthetic wonder, as the region forced observers to accept that not all things can be explained with data or theory. Moreover, the sea became an important symbol for explorers and writers who documented their journeys through a world larger than maps alone suggested. They learned that not everything could be predicted, and that human observation always had limitations. The region taught patience, precision, and reverence for mysteries beyond control or full comprehension. You may imagine generations experiencing the too-perfect stillness as a reminder that the world extends beyond what can be measured or categorized. Within the silence of maps and records, the unnaturally calm sea reflected back human understanding itself. Its apparent simplicity revealed the complexity of perception, the boundaries of time and space, and the relationship between humans and nature. You may imagine map readers contemplating not only direction and distance, but also the subjective experience of being in a region that defied certainty. Ultimately, the region remained a part of the layered landscape of human knowledge, not because it could be fully explained, but because it compelled humans to continue asking, observing, and accepting that some parts of the world will always lie beyond complete understanding. You may sense how this region teaches that true knowledge embraces uncertainty and the beauty of mystery, and that maps and records are only the beginning of a larger journey to comprehend the world and humanity's place within it. Over time, the stories of the unnaturally calm sea became part of an enduring oral and written tradition among sailors, explorers, and mapmakers. You may imagine these tales being read aloud on ship decks at night as the waves lulled the crew to sleep, or transcribed in monasteries by scribes attempting to capture the experiences of journeys across a vast world. Each generation added its own layer of interpretation, transforming the region into a space where imagination and observation merged. The stillness of the sea became not only a physical phenomenon, but also a symbol of human awareness of the limits of knowledge and the importance of careful observation. Sailors and scientists began to note that the region subtly affected human perception in ways not always easily explained. Hourglasses appeared to run faster or slower, shadows shifted, watercolors changed gradually, and light seemed to possess inconsistent direction and intensity. You may sense how these phenomena compelled observers to question their assumptions about time, space, and the natural laws they knew. Each new account added another layer of mystery, encouraging humility in the face of a world far larger and more complex than any instrument or record could measure. In the context of mapmaking, this region challenged the limits of representation. Mapmakers no longer simply drew lines and marked land, but also had to allow for uncertainty, noting the effects of the area on human perception and phenomena that could not be explained. You may imagine faint lines and subtle symbols appearing between land and sea boundaries, communicating to readers that the world was not merely measurable geometry, but also a subjectively experienced space. Furthermore, the unnaturally calm sea taught explorers and scientists the value of patience, meticulous observation, and acceptance of uncertainty. They learned that not all phenomena could be immediately understood, and that the world held layers of mystery to be explored slowly. The stillness of the sea served as a reminder that science and knowledge are not only about certainty, but also about respecting questions and finding beauty in ambiguity. Ultimately, the region remained an enduring symbol of the boundaries of human knowledge, a space where careful observation, imagination, and curiosity intersect. You may imagine map makers and sailors gazing at it on scrolls or across the calm horizon, feeling both awe and humility. The too perfect stillness taught that the world always holds something left to discover, and that mystery is an inseparable part of the human experience. As knowledge of the unnaturally calm sea developed, scholars began to realize that the region challenged not only human senses, but also traditional scientific methods. You may imagine them sitting for hours in workrooms filled with maps, notes, and simple instruments, attempting to find consistent patterns and phenomena that seemed random. They recognized that observational methods successful elsewhere did not always provide answers here. Hourglasses, shadows, watercolors, and light all defied expected regularity, as if the region possessed its own internal laws. Scientists began to understand that studying this region required integrating multiple disciplines: astronomy, hydrography, meteorology, and human perception. They sought connections between physical and psychological phenomena, acknowledging that sailors' perceptions could be influenced by the extreme stillness and unfamiliarity of the area. You can sense how each report was tested repeatedly, compared with previous records, and documented meticulously to build a framework of understanding, even if it could never be complete. Moreover, the region compelled mapmakers to consider the value of symbolic and subjective representation. They began adding faint lines, subtle patterns, and small notes indicating the uncertainty of the phenomena. You may imagine how each symbol and marginal note became a reminder to readers that the world contains aspects that cannot be directly measured, and that careful observation is one of the ways humans engage with uncertainty. The documented phenomena also taught that extreme stillness and quiet could produce profound experiences affecting perceptions of time, space, and the surrounding environment. Slowing hourglasses, lengthening shadows, shifting watercolors, and light moving in unpredictable rhythms all became part of a larger record of human interaction with the world not yet fully understood. Ultimately, the unnaturally calm sea became a symbol of dialogue between empirical knowledge and subjective experience. You may imagine scholars, sailors, and mapmakers gazing at their charts and notes with the awareness that not everything can be explained, that the world has layers of mystery awaiting exploration, and that human understanding is always limited. The perfect stillness taught patience, curiosity, and reverence for what cannot be fully articulated. The region remained a lasting reminder that mystery is an inseparable part of human exploration and the pursuit of knowledge. As new reports continued to arrive from sailors who had crossed the unnaturally calm sea, scholars began to see that subjective experience played an increasingly important role in understanding the phenomenon. You may imagine them arranging these accounts on a wide table, observing the differences in how each sailor described the sensation of slowed time, lengthened shadows, or shifting watercolors. Each description, though unique, seemed to resonate with a general pattern that defied rational explanation. This forced scientists to accept that human perception was not a passive instrument, but part of a complex ecosystem of experience. They began noting that the profound sense of stillness could influence how sailors judged distance, speed, and direction. Hourglasses, usually reliable indicators of time, began to lose meaning when the entire environment appeared to move according to its own rhythm. You can sense how scholars revisited theories about currents, magnetic fields, or light refraction to evaluate how much the physical elements contributed and how much subjective perception dominated. In the process, they realized that the physical world and psychological experience could not be separated. They interacted subtly and continuously, forming a narrative that could only be partially understood. Additionally, mapmakers began marking the region with interpretive symbols, emphasizing the inherent uncertainty of the phenomenon. They used soft lines, faint shading, and marginal notes to show that maps were not merely mechanical representations of reality, but tools for navigating human experience in mysterious spaces. You may imagine how each symbol became a bridge between empirical observation and acknowledgement of inexplicable strangeness. The phenomenon also prompted scientists to reflect on the limits of their own knowledge. They realized that, no matter how detailed and meticulous their records were, the region retained dimensions that could not be measured. They began to accept that some aspects of the world could only be understood through an awareness of uncertainty itself. You can sense how the extreme stillness of the sea became a silent teacher, imparting patience, curiosity, and appreciation for things beyond the reach of science. Ultimately, the unnaturally calm sea became a metaphor for the limits of human capacity to comprehend the universe. You may imagine scholars gazing at their notes with respect, recognizing that mystery is not a weakness of knowledge, but part of the beauty of the world. They ended each day with the understanding that every observation, however incomplete, added a layer of insight and reverence toward something greater than themselves. Over time, scholars began to realize that the unnaturally calm sea challenged not only the understanding of physical phenomena, but also prompted deep reflection on the human relationship with their surrounding environment. You may imagine them sitting in silence, holding ancient notes, contemplating how each sailor brought their own perception and personal experience into the collective narrative. They came to understand that the region was not merely a geographical point, but a space where reality and human perception intersected, forming something more complex than a simple natural condition. Scientists noticed that reports of the calm sea were often accompanied by notes on the mental state of sailors. Some reported profound feelings of peace, while others experienced anxiety or confusion due to the irregularities in time and light they encountered. You can sense how scholars attempted to correlate these physical phenomena with psychological responses, recognizing that the two interacted in patterns that were not always predictable. Extreme stillness seemed to influence sensory perception, creating experiences unique to each individual while still following collective patterns that could be observed. Additionally, mapmakers began marking the region with symbols that conveyed not only location, but also qualities of experience. Soft lines, faint shading, and marginal notes became ways to indicate that the region possessed characteristics that could not be fully explained with measurements or numbers. You may imagine how these symbols served as reminders that mapping was not simply reproducing the physical world, but interpreting human interaction with aspects beyond conventional understanding. Scholars began to accept that the mystery of the region might be intentionally preserved by nature, that the world does not always fully reveal itself to humans. They realized that careful observation and accurate records were only part of the process of appreciating the complexity of nature. You can sense how this recognition fostered a greater respect for the environment, with each journey and record serving not only to understand, but also to coexist with uncertainty. Ultimately, the unnaturally calm sea became a symbol of human awareness that the world contains layers of mystery beyond an individual's ability to fully unravel them. You may imagine the scholars closing their notebooks with respect and awe, understanding that the stillness of the sea imparted lessons in patience, observation, and reverence for something greater than themselves. With this awareness, the region remained preserved in records, maps, and collective memory as a space where humans learned to honor the limits of their knowledge. As the centuries passed and the number of sailors' accounts and scientific observations grew, the unnaturally calm sea began to acquire an identity as a space that challenged the boundaries of human knowledge. You may imagine scholars sitting in workrooms bathed in soft light from large windows, examining fading scrolls of maps and marking new reports with delicate ink. Each incoming account, even from disparate voyages, evoked wonder because they revealed similar patterns of extraordinary stillness, shifting light and time that seemed to slow or accelerate. Scientists and mapmakers began to understand that the region was not merely an anomaly that could be measured conventionally. They observed that its effects on human perception, how sailors experienced movement, light, and time, were as important as the physical phenomena themselves. You can sense how they weighed each report, recognizing that the subjective experiences of sailors were an integral part of the accounting, integral part of the larger picture, and that the region served as a mirror of the complex interaction between nature and human consciousness. Furthermore, they noted that the area seemed capable of creating order within apparent chaos. Waves remained calm, distant sounds were muted, and light adapted in subtle yet consistent ways. These phenomena could not be fully explained by the physics known at the time, leading scholars to realize they were touching the limits of knowledge, requiring careful observation, intuition, and patience. You may imagine how these records became guidance, not only for understanding the region, but also for training human perception to be more sensitive to the environment. Over time, the calm sea became a kind of natural laboratory where scientists learned to appreciate uncertainty as part of the world. They began to see that every voyage, every account, and every new map added a fragmentary yet valuable layer of understanding. You can sense how the region encouraged humans to accept that not everything can be explained or controlled, and that mystery itself can be part of the learning process. Ultimately, the unnaturally calm sea remained present in historical records and maps as a symbol of challenging tranquility, a place where humans learn to observe, comprehend, and respect something greater than themselves. You may imagine scholars closing their map scrolls with awe and reverence, understanding that the stillness of the sea, tested not only their intellectual capacity, but also instilled a deep appreciation of humanity's relationship with nature, time, and space. Over time, the records concerning the unnaturally calm sea began to influence how sailors and scholars approached voyages and exploration. You may imagine them preparing for journeys with heightened attention to details previously considered trivial. Subtle changes in the color of the sky, unusual wave patterns, or strange vibrations in the ship that seemed to signal something beneath the water's surface. They began to understand that the region was not merely a route to traverse, but a space where subjective experience became an essential instrument for comprehending the world. Scholars emphasized the importance of meticulous documentation and consistent observation. They wrote about how changes in light, sound, and time interacted to form an overall experience inseparable from the region itself. You can sense how each new account added layers of complexity, leading mapmakers to recognize that maps were not only geographic representations, but also records of human experience living alongside phenomena that challenged conventional understanding. Moreover, the unnaturally calm sea inspired philosophical reflection on humanity's relationship with nature. Scientists realized that extreme stillness fostered introspection and allowed them to perceive the world with greater patience and precision. They understood that the region required attention to the smallest details and a respect for uncertainty as a natural aspect of maritime experience. You may imagine how these moments of quiet offered space for profound thought about time, space, and the limits of human knowledge. As generations passed, these accounts became part of the education for new sailors. They learned to read subtle signs, to appreciate silence, and to observe the world patiently. The sea became an invisible teacher, demonstrating that not everything can be mastered or predicted. You can sense how this awareness instilled respect for uncertainty and for the human capacity to learn from experiences that cannot be fully explained. Ultimately, the unnaturally calm sea came to be seen as a symbol of the interaction between physical phenomena and human perception. It taught that the world does not always conform to measurable laws, and that human experience can broaden our understanding of reality. You may imagine sailors and scholars closing their notes with reverence, recognizing that the region remains a space where mystery and observation coexist, creating a rich and evolving comprehension of the world they explored. As the records regarding the unnaturally calm sea continued to accumulate, scholars began to notice connections between the phenomenon and broader natural patterns, such as global ocean currents, weather cycles, and the movement of stars across the night sky. You may imagine them sitting in simple observatories with telescopes, compasses, and years of astronomical notes, attempting to find alignment between sailors' accounts and larger patterns. They realized that the region might act as a point where the complex interaction of wind, currents, light, and time became most apparent. Each new report from sailors traversing the area added layers of understanding, yet always left more questions than answers. Scholars emphasized that direct experience was crucial to understanding the region. Observation and documentation became more than scientific technique. They became practices linking the mind with nature. You can sense how sailors and scholars realized their records were not merely practical navigational information, but archives of experience that allowed comprehension of phenomena that could not be measured with simple instruments. They began to see the region as a natural laboratory. It's a space where the laws of nature appeared to interact in ways rarely visible elsewhere. Furthermore, the unnaturally calm sea highlighted that the world possesses a subjective dimension not fully explainable. You may imagine scholars discussing how the stillness affected perceptions of time, light, and sound, and how it altered the relationship between humans and their environment. The region demonstrated that natural phenomena are not always linear or predictable. Sometimes they are complex, demanding patience, precision, and respect for uncertainty. Thus, the maps they created became not only tools for navigation, but also records of human experience confronting the extraordinary. Every symbol, every fine line, and every marginal note became part of an archive combining physical reality with human perception. You may sense how generations of sailors and scholars came to view the unnaturally calm sea, not merely as a geographic anomaly or obstacle, but as a teacher imparting lessons in patience, careful observation, and openness to evolving mysteries. Ultimately, the region came to be understood as a point where the physical world and human experience intersected. It reminded them that science and perception were not separate, but mutually enriching. You may imagine sailors closing their notes with reverence, aware that the unnaturally calm sea would remain both a symbol of human limitations and a source of endless learning. As the unnaturally calm sea received increasing attention, scholars began to consider the implications of the phenomenon for maritime safety and geographic knowledge. You may imagine them studying sailors' reports across centuries, observing patterns that recurred. Like subtle swirls, never exactly the same, yet consistently marking specific regions on the map. The extraordinary stillness of the sea was not only puzzling, but it also inspired profound respect for nature. Sailors crossing the area often noted that, although there were no waves, storms, or visible dangers, the region carried an aura that kept them alert, as if the sea itself demanded a caution beyond ordinary navigation. Scientists emphasized that understanding this region required a holistic approach, combining visual observation, timekeeping, sound, light, and human perception. You may imagine them laying all of this data across long tables, arranging schemes and diagrams, attempting to find hidden connections among seemingly unrelated phenomena. Every report, no matter how small, was valued for offering clues to the region's character, even though no single theory could fully explain its complexity. The area became a natural laboratory where scientific rigor met human experience. And it was here that new knowledge slowly began to emerge. Furthermore, scholars began drafting guidelines for sailors who would traverse the area in the future, not to provide definite answers, but to help them record phenomena meticulously. You can sense how their advice emphasized patience, attention to detail, and acceptance of the unexplained. The unnaturally calm sea became a point where humans were taught that uncertainty is not failure, but part of a larger experience of understanding the world. Ultimately, the region came to be understood as a space where natural phenomena and human perception intersected. You may imagine sailors marking the location on their maps with careful symbols, not as a threat, but as a reminder of human limitations and the wonders still present in the world. The unnaturally calm sea remained a mystery demanding respect, careful observation, and endless curiosity. It taught that the world cannot always be fully explained. Yet every observation, every record, every line on a map became a step toward deeper understanding.